Welcome to the Insight Scoop, Ion Ivy's podcast series that provides direct insight into the world of college applications and profile building. My name is Shanza Khan, and I'm the founder and head counselor at Ion Ivy. On today's episode, we'll be talking about subject selection and which grades matter the most. I have with me two extremely high-achieving and determined guests. First off, I'd like to introduce Zoya Waqas, a recent graduate from Learning Alliance International, an IB student, hoping to study law and international relations at the University of Edinburgh. Zoya's passion lies in standing up for what she believes in, whether that's through public speaking, art, or research and analysis. Next up, we have Irha Hassan, another student from Learning Alliance DHA, but from the Cambridge stream, hoping to study political science at either the University of Toronto or at St. Lawrence in the US. She sees her future career in law and enjoys reading research papers in her free time. Very ambitious. So let's get started. Guys, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you for asking.
I'm also doing good. Thank you for having us.
So I'm going to start off with some fundamental questions for both of you. And I just want our listeners to know that you are answering Zoya from the perspective of the IB curriculum, and Irha, you from the Cambridge O and A levels curriculum. So we will begin with the very basics. Should I worry about subject selection when I am choosing my subjects for the IBDP or for A levels? Zoya, why don't you begin?
Okay, so this is what I believe. The answer to this is relatively obvious because when you're entering into DP, it's also around the same time that you start worrying about college applications. So at this point, you should have a general sense of direction about what you want to do with the rest of your life. Because essentially universities will require you to take certain subjects. I know about medical universities, you have to take all three sciences at certain levels, and that is an entry requirement for the universities that you are applying to. So when you enter into DP, not only is it important for the universities that you're applying to, but it's also important generally to be able to build a sort of student profile for yourself, because this is around the time that you start taking extracurriculars and you start taking, when you know that you have a certain interest, you start taking extracurriculars that cater to that interest. And then you're able to build up a profile that you can use to essentially show the universities that you're applying to, this is what I'm bringing to the table. And this is why my experience, which is relevant to the subjects that I have chosen in DP, is going to help me in my further academic route. So essentially, that is why DP subject selection is extremely, extremely important.
Irha, just shifting on to you for a bit, does the same thing apply at A levels? Did you have to make sure you knew what subjects you were choosing at the A levels, or you thought I'm just going to experiment?
All right. So I think that it varies, especially in terms of if you want to go for like a set career path, such as medicine, engineering, or like something in computer sciences. And obviously the prerequisite varies, and universities also put a lot of importance in the sort of subjects you choose, especially in these three particular fields that I personally felt like that was important. But otherwise, if you want to do something like, for instance, political sciences or anything like in the social sciences, humanities, business, economics, etc., I don't necessarily think that you have to choose certain subjects. Rather, it is a good idea to have like a combination of subjects that allow you to explore your interests over the 2 years, and have subjects that are A, interesting to you, but B, choose the difficulty level that you can handle, as A levels tends to get quite tougher by the end of the second year. So I think in that terms, my personal experience was that despite having like sciences in my A levels, I still went on to choose something that was completely different. And that also gave me an opportunity to, just choose whatever I wanted in the end. So it really depends on what you want to do, especially in terms of countries like the UK or the Europe or Canada. They really look at the prerequisite subjects that you have. And I think that's essentially very important as compared to, if you're going to a liberal arts college in the US, then then you probably don't have to, care about the particular subjects. So I guess it is kind of the same, but again, it depends on the kind of career path you want to choose, you want to go on to.
So, Irha, you hit on exactly the point I wanted to highlight. It really varies by country. And since you applied primarily to North America, particularly as far as the US is concerned, there are mostly, not all the time, but mostly not, serious prerequisites set in stone. However, Zoya, for law, for instance, did you face any prerequisites? And can you comment more about the UK subject selection process for IBDP or A levels?
With the UK, and this is sort of intimidating because it means that you have to know what you're doing with your life, not at 18, which most people think is the time when you're finally on your own, but rather at 16, because that is the age where you have to start writing personal statements and you have to, again, like I mentioned before, start taking extracurriculars that are relevant to the career that you've chosen for yourself. And essentially with UK universities, you're only crafting one personal statement that goes out to all 5 of the universities that you've selected. So it's important that the universities don't think that you're confused about the path that you're going into. And so it's really, really important when you're applying anywhere in the UK that you know from the get-go what you're going into. And especially with law, I had to be very certain at a very young age. Luckily, I already had that sort of experience because I come from a family of bureaucrats and I'm Kashmiri myself. So I've always, I think my clear-headedness can be accredited to the background that I come from. But otherwise, I think like you just have to be really, really certain about what you're doing.
I think you note a very important point, Zoya, that for students applying to the UK, you have to make up your mind with regard to a particular career path very early on, because once you get accepted to a university, in your case, University of Edinburgh, you can't pivot that, oh, I got accepted for law, I've changed my mind and I now want to do history. You're essentially locked into the degree that you're going to do. So you better be sure that this is the profession and career path you want to follow. Irha, for our audience, can you comment on whether Canada is the same way or not?
I think it varies from university to university, but at the same time, I don't necessarily think that is the case for Canada because as long as, again, you have the prerequisites, you can still like declare your specialty in the second year and they still give you an option. And you might have to take a lot like other courses in your first year to meet those prerequisites, or you need to have a certain GPA to get into that stream because obviously you're going to transfer. Like in my case, like if I want to shift from social sciences to a life science or a health sciences degree, then obviously I need to have my A-level grades, which should be like above a certain grade, such as B plus. And second, I need to have a good GPA and I need to take those courses in my first year to meet those requirements in my second year. So I do think that they have this option to change, but again, it entirely depends on how much effort you want to put in and which career path you actually have interest in long term, so you can actually shift your perspective later on. So yes, I think that for Canada you can still change as compared to the UK.
So our audience, a little bit more flexibility on the Canadian side, vis-a-vis if you move a bit further down, USA is completely different for the most part. And Irha, can you talk to our audience a little bit about how much flexibility do you have there?
In the US, I think in the US, you have a lot of flexibility in terms of what you want to study and how you want to study, especially like I've heard from a lot of people that especially in your first year, you have to take a number of courses that like have different like varied like different interests and they're centered around different like career paths, so you have to take all of them and you can choose and select and pick and choose which you want to take. And down like I've seen people like changing their majors even in their third year or even in their second year. So I think that necessarily like only happens in the US because they give you this sort of leeway to actually change your to change your majors and to change your career paths. But again, that is something that the US only provides, that it allows you to have that freedom in their system, and their education system sort of allows you to gain like a lot of like experience from learning, so you can just choose what you want to learn. But if you don't like it, that's perfectly fine. You can change it later down the route, and you won't be like seen as someone who's like indecisive or anything, because that's something that's really common there. So I think that's a really plus point for the US. If you're not sure what you want to study and like where do you want to like see like which career path you want to take, then it is really good for you to go to the US, because they're the only I think their education system is the only one that provides you that sort of freedom to change your majors and to change your career paths so frequently without any prerequisites. So yeah.
So that is absolutely correct. And just for the listeners' clarification, a university will allow you till the end of your sophomore year to declare your major. That is the end of your second year. So you have a significant amount of time to experiment. I got admission for political science. I took a course in journalism. I want to go down that road. But in Canada, you may have to see what the policy is university per year university, and Zoya does absolutely not have that flexibility to do so. So on that, which is a very big decision, and I want to kind of run through that a little bit, Zoya. So you worked the other way around. You decided that you wanted to become a lawyer, so you chose your profession at a young age, 15, 16, without having been a lawyer. And then you decided, okay, what subjects do I have to take in my A levels in order to get into the top universities in the UK? So working in reverse, I would like you to flesh out for us, how did you make that decision to commit yourself to a particular profession, in this case, law? How did you go about that process? What was your thinking? Whom did you consult? What did you do?
Okay, so this is a very good question, because I think there's really so much that went into it. And obviously, like I've mentioned this before, but I already had a sense of direction or interest towards law. And I always, to some degree, was certain that I wanted to go into law. But the thing is, when it came down to it, when I had to sit down and when I had to choose the courses in the universities that I was applying to, I had to think about it very, very realistically. I had to think about which subjects I excelled at rather than which subjects I could potentially do well at. And I had to be very, very clear-headed with this. I had to think about this with a lot of clarity and with deep introspection and a realistic assessment of what I could do. So when I thought about law, what really solidified it as a career path for me was how I was scoring in the relevant subjects. So now I chose global politics when I came into DP, and right off the bat, it just clicked with me. Like I was getting good scores, I was interested in it, and it was just something that made perfect sense to me, as opposed to the sciences, which have always been a relatively weak point for me. So at that stage, I finally realized that, okay, fine, law is something that I'm not only interested in, but I'm also good in, and I can get concrete results in. And these results are really important because essentially you have to be doing well in a subject in order to be able to apply for a position and expect some sort of offer from them. So I think that is definitely something that you have to consider then. And working in reverse is, of course, like a really good way to put it, because you really, really have to consider yourself when it comes to it.
Zoya, I think one more part you may want to share with the listeners, and that's because I know your history a little bit, is you decided to do several immersion internships in law as well, which may or may not have contributed to your decision.
Right, of course. No, I think in the summer of DB1, there was initially some confusion because I had selected two subjects at HR. I had psychology and I had global politics. And in both of these subjects, not only did both of these subjects pique my interest, but I was also doing equally well in both of these subjects. So I was starting to have some second thoughts. I was starting to think, okay, your entire life you've only thought about law, but what if this is another field that you could do equally well at? And that is when I was recommended to go into some internships. I sat down with my college counselors and we looked at the various different experiences I could undergo during my summer vacations. And then I eventually ended up landing a job with Justice Project Pakistan. And I think this experience was truly enlightening for me because it gave me some very on-ground exposure to the field that I had, I guess, some reservations about. And I was at that point still wondering, like, you have no real-world experience in this. Are you sure you could do well in it? And when I went there, I'd not only had the opportunity to work with professional lawyers, but also work with the clients. And I read several of their case files. And what Justice Project Pakistan essentially does is that they work with the criminalization of the death penalty in Pakistan. And they work with specifically a large part of their work is dedicated to juveniles and trying to get them off the death row. And so a lot of them are also related to police torture or the custodial bill for violence. And anyway, so I went through all of that. I went through the paperwork. I went through the meetings with the clients, and it really, really solidified for me, I think, an interest in the field of law, because through their work, I got to see a direct mirror of where I wanted to be in the future. So the internship was an extremely enlightening experience in that sense, and I came out much more certain about the field of law.
I should have mentioned this in the intro, but both these girls are head girls of their respective schools, or former head girls now that they have graduated, which also kind of defines the responsibility and ambition and the drive that they have. Irha, in addition to being accepted at University of Toronto, secured admissions in some of the most prestigious universities in North America and even the satellite campuses like Duke, Kushan in China. Irha, tell me that since you originally started off with the sciences and yet applied for a political science international relations stream, how did you demonstrate your narrative or interest in the subject in your application? And what exact subjects did you have in your A-levels for the knowledge of our listeners and audience?
Okay, all right. So that is a question that my parents also ask me a lot, since they're like two very different career paths and very different sort of educations that your degrees that you're kind of pursuing. So I think that unconsciously I have always been interested in politics and global affairs and all that sort of subjects, but I never realized it fully. I think it was when A-levels, mid of A-levels, after I was done with my AS, I realized that I really liked sociology, which I took as an additional subject. And I didn't have to put in that much effort in it, but I still did significantly better in it as compared to my sciences subject. So that's when I started reading up on what could I do with a similar subject pathway. And then I read some research papers. I went on to websites on respective universities pages, and I read about their faculty and looked at the research papers and the sort of ideas that they were developing. That's how I think that that's how my interest started to build up. But additionally, I was also very actively part of the debating circuit in Pakistan. So I think that sort of having those everyday conversation and those debates and having those activities already meant that I was more inclined towards political science in the very first place. I was doing Model United Nations since I was in O1. So I think that also helped me choose that this is something that I want to do and this is a career path path that I'm actually like going to be happy with long term. Again, the idea of doing law later on is something that I still haven't decided upon yet completely, but I do think that with a degree in like political science or something like international relations as a minor or like as a sub study, I think I'll still be set for like for any career path. So I think that varies, and you have to like keep on taking extracurriculars from like the really start of O1, which I advise everyone to do, so that you know that this is something that you might be interested in. Like take like a bunch of activities in like environment, and like take like internships with like WWF, and I did like a lot of like internship with student built organizations such as Eco Dosti, etc., like which really helped me like sort of define. At the same time, I also did internships at hospitals, and I clearly knew that this was something that I couldn't do long term. Like at that moment when I was in the operation theater, one day I was like, no, this is something that I can totally not do. So I think that those summers that you have in between of your like classes, you need to like start like looking for opportunities and connect with your counselors and like ask them to find you opportunities, so that you know that this is something that you actually want to do long term. You just don't have to think of it like, okay, I'll do this degree, but then what? Like you have to like think of a long-term plan that you'll be happy in, that you'll be comfortable in, that you'll actually enjoy throughout the years. University life is not just supposed to be, you know, getting that degree, but it should also be enjoyable in the process. Like you're learning a lot. You should have that drive and ambition for that particular subject that you're actually going to study for in the very first place. So I think that particularly was the case for me. So that's how I shifted from like a completely like sciences to a political science degree. And I think that's how everyone should start thinking as well. Like what is something that they want to do long term? So for me as well, like particularly when I was thinking about it, like I did like made like a list. I did like rankings of like career paths. I did like firstly in terms of like the interest like I have, and then secondly in terms of like the level of difficulty in terms of like work life balance, will I have that or not, and thirdly like how much like satisfaction am I going to get like in that particular career path or in that job. So I think across all three levels, that's was something that I was still ranking like at the highest. So that's how I did it. So I think that everyone should like sort of like rank it, or maybe just like meet a lot of people from that particular career path to make a very informed decision about what they want to do.
Irha, I could almost see a bar chart coming up when you were saying I was doing ranking according to this metric or this metric.
Yeah,
And I think that's just an amazing exercise for any student to go through. Another really important takeaway for our listeners is the point you raised, that immerse yourself in a lot of extracurriculars, which will allow you to see whether this is something or not that you want to do.
Yes.
Even though you originally started out as a science student, having a medical shadowship confirmed that this is not the pathway for you. So, you know, that I really do want our listeners to have that as a takeaway. Another subject which some people shy away from discussing, but now that you've graduated, we're gonna put all cards on the table. Zoya, tell me, when you were selecting your DP subjects, did you take into account how difficult that subject was? Should I take it at HL level, at SL level? Which one would I score more in? How important was the difficulty of your subject in selecting it in accordance with the requirement of a university? How did you go about that? What was the thought process? You know, these are what I call things that other students really want to know, but people generally shy away from talking about.
Right. So I guess this ties into what I said earlier. And I think subject difficulty is definitely a huge factor, especially as an IB student, that you have to take into consideration. Because universities will want certain grade requirements out of you from your HL subject selection particularly. Luckily at Learning Alliance International, you have the option to sit down and take some summer classes, so you can have essentially trials for what the experience is going to be like. And two of the subjects that I'd taken at higher levels, that those were psychology and global politics, are extremely, extremely course intensive. But I also had to think about my interest in those subjects. And because I was so interested in these subjects, a lot of the course intensive portion of it actually became entertaining for me. I liked the research work aspect of it. I liked sitting down and taking notes. And I think that is one way that you can truly overcome what appears like a very daunting subject from afar, is if you choose them very smartly, and if you choose them with both one, which is interest, and two, an assessment of how well you can perform. So because I considered the fact that these were two subjects that I was interested in, I was also able to score well in them. When you're an IB student, there's not only, I mean, of course, like I mentioned, HL subjects are extremely important because your universities require a certain minimum grade requirement for those HL subjects. But because you're an IB student, they not only need to see your 3 grades in those 3 subjects, but they need to see the overall out of 45 score. So the condition that I currently hold is, I think it's 666 at higher level, and it is a total 37 out of 45 points. And if I don't meet either of those, so it could be that I get 666 at higher level, but let's say I get a 36 out of 45, I will not meet my condition, or the other way around. And if I don't meet that condition, then the university is under no obligation to send their offer to me. So when you're an IB student, this is definitely something that you have to be extra cautious of. You have to take subjects that you know you can excel at overall. You can't completely disregard the SL subjects, or you can't pretend that they are of no relevance. So you really have to look at everything holistically and be very clever about the subjects that you've chosen, because all of them will play a part in your acceptance from the university of your choice.
So thank you for that very honest answer, because I think it's important for students who are going from MYP into DP to know that at the end of this journey, for most universities around the world, you have to meet, conditional offers, and you have to meet subject and grade requirements, which would, in your case, require 666 at the HL level, which is an extremely high ask. And a lot of pressure that one must take. So along with considering your interests, factoring in subjects which you are passionate about and which you can score well in is very important. Irha, I believe in Canada, you have similar pressures coming up, even though you are in the A-level stream. Can you comment a little bit about that?
All right. So I think that's the particular issue with applying to countries like the Canada or the UK, because the conditions that you have to meet are extremely high. Like, for instance, it does not matter, even if I'm doing a degree that is completely irrelevant to the subjects I took in A levels, I still have to meet those conditions. So for me, the conditions are 3 A's and in those very sciences subjects, despite going into a program that's solely humanities and social sciences. I think so if you put that into account, then you have to think that whether I will be able to meet those conditions if I want to go to these respective countries, right? If you don't think that you're not able to meet those conditions by the end of your second year, then you can just choose to apply to the US and stick to it and work hard to work hard on your profile to get into good US colleges, because they're mostly not conditional, and you can still get in despite having the pressure and despite having the anxiety of getting those particular grades, since universities tend to be very, very strict about it. So I think yes, that's absolutely true. You need to take into account how difficult or how easier the subject is, so that later on you don't have issues like trying to get good grades in those very subjects. But overall, if you're a good student who enjoys academics and is very invested into their studying, then I don't think that's necessarily an issue for you despite the subjects you take. It just matters on your interests, on which subject you're more interested in, and what is your sort of passion. So I do think that's very important as well.
And just for our viewers' knowledge, Irha, what are the conditional requirements of University of Toronto?
So for a lot of people who from my batch who got in, there are different sort of requirements and conditions. So I do think it is based upon your predicted grades and your AS level grades. So for me, it was 3 A's for the sciences, and there was 1 C, which I don't think necessarily is important. So I'll just talk about the 3As, since that's a lot of like, that's a really high requirement, especially when you have worked like when you have good grades in the AS as well, and you don't even have to like get into a program that is that competitive compared to like other like engineering or medical programs. So for that, so in keeping that in mind, I think that for me, like the pressure of getting 3As is so much that like sometimes like you really have to consider like, was it a really wise choice for me to go, like you reflect back into your A levels and you think that, was it really a wise choice for me to take sciences in the very first place, considering that I'm not even going to a program that is requires those grades in the very first place. So I do think that you have to keep that factor in mind, since you in the second year of A levels, there's a lot of pressure of college applications. You have your SAT going on. You have a lot of other stuff going on. You need to perfect your profile, etc., as well. So in that regard, you have to like take those factors also into account.
Okay, girls. So clearly it matters what your final grades, whether it's IBDP or whether it's A levels, the impact they're going to have in your final admission, because you have those acceptances in your pocket already. I just want to highlight for our viewers, what importance does, in your case, Zoya, the final MYP score have, and or your transcript as well? And then Ira, I'll throw that question to you. So Zoya.
Okay, so it's funny that you ask this, because I very recently, I think the day before yesterday, I got an email from the University of Edinburgh, and they were actually asking for my final MYP certificate, which displays my English language and literature results. And they were obviously asking this because when you're applying anywhere as an international student, you need to be proficient in the language of the country that you're applying to. And particularly for the UK, they need to see your proficiency level in English. So that is why they asked for my MYP grades. I mean, of course, the DP grades will go once they are out on the 5th of July, but they need to see your past record as well. And the reason why MYP and DP transcripts, the DP transcripts of DP1 are important is because those are actually the grades that the university receives. And on the premise of those, it will then decide whether to give you a spot or not. The final grades are now essentially just a stamp of confirmation, but your offer comes from your DP1 grades and then MYP grades. And mine, I think my offer came out, I think, in the month of November, and they were all based on my performance in the May exams of, I think, that were internally assessed. So a lot of students make the mistake of thinking that these grades are not important and they just have to do well in their final year, but it's actually much, much before that. And you need to be careful about letting yourself, not letting yourself steer off course. And I think that was definitely a struggle, maintaining a stellar academic record. But it is something that you have to really, really reel yourself in for and maintain a lot of self-discipline in order to achieve.
And Irha, did you find it to be the same way for Canada as well? What was the impact, or how much weightage does your O-level grades have, as well as your internal high school transcript from O1 onwards?
So I do think that the transcript, for me personally, I feel like it mattered more in the US applications more, since O level and A level grades, like the final grades, is something that Canadian universities really care about. Like, so if you have really good O level grades and if you end up getting like good A level grades, then you'll be fine. But like in terms of the internal performance, I don't think they factor it that much. But obviously, your predicted grades are based upon, especially in A levels, they're based upon your internal grades. So I do think that it's sort of interconnected. If you haven't given AS, then it's a good idea to have good transcripts in your A levels. But if you have given AS, then I don't think that necessarily matters unless and until your predicted grades are something that is going to be affected. So I do think for me, it really varied. Like across the applications for the both countries. For the US, I felt there was more weightage applied to those transcripts since they don't have conditions as of any sort. But for the Canadian applications, obviously the final grades matter more, and so the transcript did not really matter as much.
So just to wrap up what we heard from both of these ambitious girls, is that whether it's your MYP or whether it's your O levels, the results are extremely important, because in order to secure your conditional offer from the top universities, you have to show your performance. And to Irha's point, your internal high school transcript is also extremely important, because your predicted grades are based on your internal examinations. And I think this is something that most students often don't factor in, because they think that internal grades, your midterms, your mocks, are not of much consequence. It's only going to be your final external Cambridge examinations or IB examinations. So this is a very important takeaway I want all the viewers to have. And to just emphasize one last point that Irha just made, in the US, everything that you have done internally from 9th grade onwards is going to count, because essentially they look at your performance year to year and convert your grades into a GPA. So when you're looking at any university, whether it's Stanford, whether it's Yale, whether it's Cornell, you will be able to see the average GPA of a student that is accepted, as well as the 50th percentile and 75th percentile of the SAT score, to see where you stand against what is the level of the university you're applying. So with that, I think thank you so much to both of you for taking out the time to be with us today. I hope that our viewers appreciated all the learnings and lessons that you have imparted in terms of what subjects to choose, when to choose, how to factor in the level of difficulty, and what importance and weightage they hold in both the O levels and A levels and MYP, as well as DP. So thank you so much once again, Irha and Zoya, for joining us today on this episode of The Inside Scoop. Thank you very much.